Hello, I'm Kirk Hanson. I'm delighted to be asked to be part of this history project. My short history that'll be elaborated on is that I taught at the Stanford Business School from 1978 to 2001, was the first regular business ethics professor there. In 2001, I took early retirement and came to Santa Clara University, which is hosting this video. And at Santa Clara University, I was the executive director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics and taught business ethics in the MBA and executive MBA program. I'll start with the list of questions that they've provided for us. How did I get into this business? Well, my own history goes back to 1967. I was editor of the Stanford daily newspaper, a real daily at that point in time, and I got a call from a trustee of Stanford who asked whether I'd like to come over for the summer and spend a summer internship at Hewlett-Packard and look at corporate responsibility issues. And so I did that. It was dubbed in some newspaper articles the Radical in Residence program, although I was certainly not a radical of the 1960s. I was mildly liberal. And Hewlett-Packard, the individual, John Young, later succeeded to be chief executive of Hewlett-Packard. But I spent a summer working on corporate responsibility issues. It whetted my appetite for how companies could serve society, and it became my passion for my entire career. After undergraduate, I went to Yale Divinity School for a year as a Rockefeller Fellow, and I took an internship at Southern New England Telephone and was assigned as the #2 employee in the Urban Affairs Department, which was the name that corporate responsibility had at that point. It was the time of the Watts riots and so on. I followed that up with going to business school. After 1 year at Yale, I went to the Stanford Business School for my MBA. And during that time, two things happened. One was that the students formed a group called the Committee for Corporate Responsibility, which I became the head of, I became the director of, which was a student organization to try to promote corporate responsibility. And the second thing was that I got the opportunity to work for Ernest Arbuckle, who was chairman of Wells Fargo Bank, as an assistant in their urban affairs department, which whetted my appetite and gave me more experience as well. During that time, I also spent 6 months as a loaned officer for the National Alliance of Business. I was hired by Levi Strauss & Company, Walter Haas Jr., the CEO there, and loaned to the National Alliance of Business to work on the development of that hardcore training program for the hardcore unemployed. So I had a succession of very rapid experiences which made me passionate about corporate responsibility. I then, at the end, when I finished my MBA, a group of students and I formed the National Affiliation of Concerned Business Students. Concerned Business Students organization created chapters at 40 business schools around the United States. I traveled, gave a lot of talks from Chicago, where my wife and I were living at the time. I helped create these student organizations. That was the same 3-year period in which the Social Issues Division of the Academy of Management was formed. And so I had a very good network of relationships with faculty and considered them to be fellow travelers as well as the MBA students that I was working with. I then decided in 1975 that I would go and do graduate study myself in business ethics. I went to the Harvard Business School, was in the doctoral program, the DBA program. I went to work with Raymond Bauer, who was a social psychologist who specialized in corporate responsibility, and Ken Andrews, who was the strategy guru, who had a 4-box matrix that included the values of the chief executive. And he was concerned with how those values played themselves out in the policy of the corporation. So they were two ideal people to deal with and work with. While I was at Harvard, I did some consulting, a lot of public speeches at corporate gatherings, relationships that I'd built when I was at the Concerned Business Students. And then in 1978, got a call from George Leland Bach, who was the power behind the throne at the Stanford Business School, asking if I would like to come as a faculty member at Stanford. I came in the fall of 1978 to take up my teaching role at the Stanford Business School. I was there from 1978 until 2001. I taught 2 electives on ethics. One, a basic course in business ethics, second, international business ethics. And then I also was course head for a number of years for the required course called Business Government and the Changing Environment, later Strategy in the Non-Market Environment, 2 names that course was given over time. Then in 1996, I was asked to take over the Sloan program. It was an assistant dean kind of role. And so for 5 years, I was the faculty director of the Sloan program, which was the executive MBA. So I taught that, taught a course in that on ethics for the middle management executive MBAs. That's how I got into this. It was serendipity initially. But it was a growing passion throughout that time, and then it was a succession of very fortunate connections. I was able to get those early jobs with CEOs, Walter Haas at Levi's and John Young at Hewlett-Packard, Al Van Sinderen at Southern New England Telephone Company, and Ernie Arbuckle at Wells Fargo Bank. That gave me some standing that eventually led me to start teaching at Stanford. The next question is, what did I hope to accomplish? I think my goal from the beginning was simply to introduce business ethics into the curriculum of an MBA program. When I was an MBA student myself in 1969-70 at Stanford, Stanford started what was called the Urban Management Program, which was the beginnings of what today is the Public Management Program and the focus of the corporate responsibility work, student activities, and so on. And so I hope to make that a permanent part of the curriculum of the Stanford Business School. I hoped through the many opportunities I had right from day one at Stanford to teach in many of the executive programs. I hope to have an impact on how executives thought about business ethics. I didn't have so much an idea of what kinds of knowledge would be useful or what kinds of theories might be useful in helping practitioners to understand and be motivated to think about ethics. But I was passionate about that. I learned from a variety of people in my first couple of years how that course and my own work might be shaped. And this is relevant to how that period developed. In 1981 and 1983 and 1985, I sponsored national gatherings of researchers in the field of business ethics. The first 2 were at Stanford. The third one was at the American College, in which I co-led it with Clarence Walton. Those meetings, which brought together the new faculty who were working in the field, Pat Werhane, Tom Donaldson, Richard DeGeorge at Kansas, Jerry Kavanaugh, who was at Wayne State, later at University of Detroit, and a variety of others. We came together to try to share our ideas about what the field might become. And so that was very much a shaping time of my own views and of the field as a whole, those 3 conferences. And I just was looking back at some of the concerns. I have a couple of binders of the copies of those papers if there's ever an interest in pursuing that further. I think over time, I focused increasingly on how executives might be influenced to think about ethics. And so I taught more and more in the executive programs, as well as my role in the MBA program. I carried a very heavy teaching load during the 1980s. The other thing that happened, which was, again, serendipitous, was that I got a call from Chemical Bank to put together with Barbara Toffler, who at the time was teaching at the Harvard Business School, for Barbara and I to put together an executive seminar on ethics. And it was for Walter Shipley, who at the time was CEO of Chemical Bank, before it evolved into now Chase Manhattan. But he was the predecessor of Jamie Dimon at that point. And so Walter Shipley felt that indeed he should be helping his executives think about ethics. And so we put together a program, taught it to perhaps 150 of his senior executives over several years, 3 or 4 years. That then led to an invitation from Sandy McDonald, who was CEO of McDonnell Douglas, to do the same, not just for the leadership team at McDonnell Douglas, but also for all 35,000 employees at that point in time. So Sandy and I made a videotape in which we led people through a ethics exercise, a series of ethics exercises, total of 8 hours of workshops that every one of the 30,000 employees of McDonnell Douglas went through. And it was my first attempt to put together a whole package of ideas about how business ethics ought to be thought of within the corporation. That was shaping of what came later. So that McDonnell Douglas experience was very important, both for me personally, but also for corporate work, which I'll mention in a moment. There's a question here about what concepts I think I contributed over time. I look back at my tenure package when I came up for senior lecturer at the Stanford Business School. And the things that I talked about were the practical approach to business ethics for executives, but the very concept of 3 levels of ethics, a individual level, a corporate level, and a systemic level of ethics, was one that came out of a conversation Tom Donaldson and I had at one of those initial conferences, 1981 or 1983. We were drawing the proverbial diagrams on the back of a napkin, and we came up with that concept. So I think that was very important in helping shape the field's focus. That was also the period that I first put together a decision model, which is reflected in today's decision model from the Markkula Center, that asked executives to think about the facts of cases, to think about what they don't know and what they can still find out, that encourages executives to look at the 5 types of ethical theory, utilitarian and all of the others. And those 5 approaches also got reflected during that period of the early 1980s in Manny Velasquez's book. Manny and I worked together on several projects in the 1980 to 1984 period. And so those models, again, Manny and I were in dialogue, and that basic model that got incorporated in his book came out of those discussions. So I think those were the 2 biggest contributions on a theoretical level that I made during that time. Did my goals change over time? I think they very much did. What happened after a while was that I became better and better at the administration of this kind of work. And so in 1986, when the Defense Industry Initiatives on Business Ethics and Conduct were formed, I played a major role in working with the leaders of that, with the executive director, on shaping what happened, what became the original 18 principles and other things that happened in that early period. The work at McDonnell Douglas was directly consulted in putting together the DII approach and became the basis of it. I became more and more interested in helping companies do this work, and so formed a consulting firm at that point on the side called the Hanson Group. And we did consulting during a period of about 6 or 7 years with about 50 to 60 companies. All of the major defense contractors, 15 of them, plus a number of others. We did consulting projects that were basically teaching ethics within the organization, but also consulting on the shaping of ethics programs. I became interested in creating university initiatives. I worked with a number of colleagues at Stanford then on how would we develop ethics in the law school and how would we develop it in the medical school, how we would develop it in the engineering school, and those friends from the Stanford years remain close friends today. As I say, I ended up going into administration half-time running the Sloan program from 1996 to 2001. Simultaneous with all of that, yet one more opportunity arose, which was in 1988 while I was full-blown work on the Hanson Group and the consulting. I got a call from Norman Lear, the television producer who'd done All in the Family, Maude, Mary Hartman, The Jeffersons. He had 7 of the top 10 television programs in the mid-1980s. So in that period, Norman said, I want to create an organization which would promote ethical behavior in business by pointing at positive examples. And indeed, unfortunately, most of the cases we taught were corporate scandals and corporate disasters. And so I very much resonated to the need for stories of corporate virtue. What Norman offered was that he'd put together part of a board, Warren Buffett and a number of others, Jim Burke of Johnson & Johnson, who would be the board of this awards program in business ethics. I brought in John Young, Walter Haas of Levi's, Katharine Graham of the Washington Post, whom I knew, and a number of others, and we formed the best board in America, I think, that's ever been put together. And they met 3 times a year and debated business ethics issues, and I was the first president of that organization. We created an awards program which produced a bunch of cases on virtuous behavior in business that were widely taught. The most common of those, the most widely taught, was Merck and Company about the drug ivermectin and the river blindness epidemic. That case became, for a time, number of years, 8-10 years, the most widely taught case in business ethics. So that period, I was an administrator of what was an awards program, a foundation, a good half of my time while still teaching at Stanford. When I stepped out of that, then I got involved with the Sloan program. Finally, my goals changed in 2001 when I got offered the job as executive director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. The Markkula Center was a center which had existed. Manny Velasquez of Santa Clara had been the first executive director. But the challenge now was to take it and make it a very large center. The president of Santa Clara at the time, Paul Locatelli, was a good friend, and he said, okay, leave Stanford, come down to Santa Clara, and I'll give you freedom to build the ideal ethics center. And so I did that. I left Stanford in 2001. I was eligible for early retirement, so was able to keep my Stanford benefits and identity as an emeritus faculty member, but came to Santa Clara, had a chair here, the John Courtney Murray chair, and was given free rein to take the center in, which I did over 17 years, from 6 people to 26 people, from working in just a couple of fields, business ethics and character education in the schools, to working very heavily in medical ethics, technology ethics, government ethics, nonprofit ethics, and so on. So today, the Markkula Center is active in all of those fields, making a substantial contribution. Its biggest initiative now was one I started on artificial intelligence and ethics, which I became convinced about 8 years ago would be one of the most important issues that we would face as a society, and it would involve business ethics, which would be making widespread use of artificial intelligence, media ethics, which would be using artificial intelligence, medical ethics, and so on. And so we were able to build a team of 2 really superb experts who are promoting and pursuing that now, and that is right now the signature program of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. Mike Markkula, who had been CEO of Apple Computer, continued to provide support, but we received support from a wide range of individuals and foundations to grow the center over that period of time. The one additional conceptual idea which became more and more useful to me and embedded in the programs of the Markkula Center during that time was the concept of unavoidable ethical dilemmas in a field. And so there are a set of unavoidable ethical dilemmas in a business career. There's a set of unavoidable ethical dilemmas in the job of a journalist or the job of a senator. I came to work with state legislative leaders the last 10 years, in which I've run workshops for the speakers of all the state legislatures and the presidents of all the state senates around what are the unavoidable ethical dilemmas that they face in their jobs. And I believe as a matter of prevention and preparation, those people, as any professional, needs to think about those unavoidable dilemmas so that they can prepare what principles they're going to have and how they're going to deal with them. The next question is, what were some of the initial big questions that an academic had to face or a practitioner in business ethics had to face? I think for both the academic and the practitioner, the most important question was, can you survive? Can you survive as an academic with a new field, a field that's often bridges multiple fields? Can you get credibility in the academic environment? For the practitioner, it was if you're an advocate for business ethics, if you're an ethics officer, which developed later in the 1990s, can you survive and have influence? I think that was the major problem that both faced. And there's a lively history that I imagine others who are recorded for this historical series will relate in terms of the survival of this as an academic field. I think the people who've been most successful over time with this as an academic field are those who've had a disciplinary base. And I think today it's a combination of philosophers and people who are in psychology, sociology, organizational behavior. A few people in strategy have survived, but the people who have the strongest grounding are either the philosophers or the people in organizational behavior. Nonetheless, there are people from multiple backgrounds, my own out of studying strategy at Harvard, who found their way to survival as well. The corporate world, of course, over time has shifted. Initially, it was a hodgepodge of different types of backgrounds for business ethics officers. Then increasingly, they have become what is now called compliance officers. Most of them today have legal backgrounds and I believe a restricted view on what this field is all about. I think sadly corporate practice has tended to narrow over time to compliance. Academic practice still has a breadth of ethical issues as well as some focus on compliance. I think today with the AACSB standards and so on, there is a basis for the long-term survival of an academic field, which is not to say that it is robust at this point. There are a few doctoral programs other than today the products of Tom Donaldson and Tom Dunphy's work at Pennsylvania and a few others. There just isn't much of a pipeline. People coming into the field tend to be people from other disciplines who then adopt business ethics as their specialty. So it unfortunately remains to a great degree today as a teaching field and continues to struggle with an academic credibility, which is not to say there isn't a whole new generation of really wonderful work being done by young scholars. And I think the jury is still out here. It may be that they establish a very firm grounding over the next 10 to 15 years. There's a question here about whether business ethics is a profession. I think compliance officers in practice are trying to make compliance a practitioner field. I'm not sure that long term that's necessarily a good thing, because what tends to be, because it's legally oriented, it tends to be a subfield of legal practice with a focus on the detail of regulation, the detail of how investigations are to be conducted, and so on. I think there isn't a professional field for business ethics in the corporation, with the exception of a few individuals who emerge as that because of the confidence that a particular CEO has in them. In the academic world, I think business ethics will hopefully slowly continue to gain that credibility as a professional field, so that down the road one will be able to declare themselves a business ethics expert and look for an academic job with that specific primary focus. Today, it seems to me there are a variety of issues that we're still struggling with. We're struggling with how to address ethics as well as compliance. And so the question of what is the ethical basis for corporate activity is still an elusive concept. The Business Roundtable has just issued yet another statement. I was a consultant to the Business Roundtable in the late 1970s, helped put together the 1981 statement on businesses' responsibility is to all its stakeholders. And it's ironic to then see the Business Roundtable in 1999 say, no, its responsibility is to just the shareholders, and now in 2019 to once again issue a statement about its responsibility more broadly to all stakeholders. I think the ebb and flow of that is still, we don't have a theory for what business's responsibility is. We don't have a concept of what ethical values need to be embodied in corporate practice. And of course, we've got all the problems of what will the shareholders tolerate, what will the corporate activists, the private equity firms, and others who are taking positions in company and demanding a greater focus on profitability, what they will tolerate. Ethics, unfortunately, still remains, to some extent, the province of the most profitable firms and the firms that are still run by their founder or a founding family. We are struggling with how ethics is to be carried out in the international arena, and I think that will remain for the next 15, 20 years a major focus of attention, research, teaching. I think that we understand that most companies are international. We understand that most executives have to think about how one does ethical business in China or Russia or parts of the world that are more difficult to operate ethically in. I think that will continue to be a very important topic of discussion. I think there will continue to be a lot of work around the measurement of ethical behavior, but without a clear theory about what the responsibilities to the stakeholders are, it's hard to make the leap to measurement. Measurement will take place sort of independently of what the standard is. So you will measure the environmental impact and measure the impact on society, but what the standard is will continue to be difficult to define. All of this, of course, is bringing up yet again the debate over capitalism and whether it's possible to have values and ethics within a capitalist context. We'll be doing a lot more work on capitalism, at least in the medium term of the next 3 to 5 years. As I mentioned earlier, there's a question here, what issues and questions will we need to address? So I would say, what's the ethical basis of capitalism? What room does it have for addressing ethical questions? What is the theory of what the corporate responsibility really is? How do you measure it? And how do you measure the impact? How do you handle business internationally? And then I would bring to the fore a series of very difficult questions around technology and business ethics, and biotechnology and business ethics. Artificial intelligence and business ethics will be a major concern. Bioethics, biotechnology, and business ethics will be major concerns that we will need to pay a lot of attention to. I think a near-term concept that we'll be doing work on is the concept of ethics risk. From a very profit-oriented standpoint or long-term profitability, the company wants to know where it's at risk of outraging the public with unethical behavior. How do you predict in advance what happened at Wells Fargo Bank and the 5,000 employees who manufactured fake accounts? How do you predict in advance the fact that Boeing would have a mishap regarding the 737? How do you predict in advance the troubles that Pacific Gas and Electric, the California utility, is now facing with the wildfires? Are there ways of anticipating that in the interests of the shareholder and in the interests of society? The sentencing guidelines, the U.S. Commission on Sentencing, has added ethics risk as a category to its guidance and said every company ought to be evaluating the ethics risk that its operations have. Maybe that's greater risk if you're operating in China, or greater risk if you have tremendous pressure on your employees. That will be an area of calculation that we'll be trying to get a grip on ethics risk in the next few years. And that you don't need a change in the ethical philosophy. You just need a sophisticated understanding of where the company's basic profitability is at risk. So I think that will take quite a bit of attention as well. I think that's basically the story I want to tell that's part of the way companies have dealt with ethics and schools have dealt with ethics. There are a couple of questions raised by the Society for Business Ethics Board that I do want to address, and I think I'm not over my time as yet. At Stanford, business ethics has a role in the required course on strategy in the non-market environment, but it is what I thought of as a positive role. How do we predict when a company will get in trouble? How do we predict when people will be very outraged by the company? And so you study ethical theory as a way of understanding when people will feel that there's an inequity existing, or there will be enough outlandish corporate behavior to provoke a reaction by your employees or by your customers, and so on. So that positive approach to business ethics or to the ethical component of business continues to dominate the Stanford approach to this. Hired political scientists who have that as their approach, and they've very much driven that required course in recent years. The ethics electives have been taught by a series of people at Stanford over time, and Scotty McLennan, for example, who taught at Harvard, did the course that was originally created on great literature and ethics. Scotty continues to teach that at the Stanford Business School, and there are a few others who have come in to teach one or two courses on ethics, but at least to my knowledge, there isn't a single approach taken by those. They each have their unique approach to the electives on ethics. At Santa Clara, as a Jesuit institution, there was a firm commitment from the very beginning to teach ethics as a part of the teaching of any field. And so when Manny Velasquez got interested in this as chair of philosophy in the late 1970s, early 1980s, he took a bunch of courses, so he had the equivalent of an MBA, and then moved over to the business school to teach business ethics and write his path-breaking book, which was the bestseller for so many years, Business Ethics, Concepts and Cases. And so Manny introduced the notion that every student ought to take an ethics course, which has been the case in the undergraduate curriculum for many, many years. That is spread around the university so that every undergraduate now takes a required ethics course in ethical theory, and then roughly 60 to 70% take one more course of some type that deals with ethics issues, perhaps in their specific field, media ethics or political ethics or engineering ethics. And so courses exist. One of the works of the Markkula Center, we assembled 73 faculty in all departments of the university with an interest in ethics. And we ran programs for them, helping them to teach ethics in their disciplines and involving them in a series of events of various kinds. So that work at Santa Clara has gone on. It's firmly established. There's now an increasing percent of the graduate students who have the requirement to do a course on ethics as a part of their MBA now, or their engineering degree, their information sciences degree, and so on. So it's spread pretty widely and is firmly established at Santa Clara. The Markkula Center clearly has had a major role in that. The Markkula Center director is seen as a member of the Dean's Council, and so I sat on that for 17 years. Because we have the status of a dean, the executive director, you're able to do deals with different schools within the university, joint programs, and so on. For example, we loaned one of our Markkula Center staff to the engineering school for 2 years, where he developed all the initial courses in engineering ethics. Then we found them another faculty member to replace him, and so that ethics would be firmly established within engineering. I think that it covers most of the material and is probably close to an hour of material. Let me just make a couple of comments about other people that I owe a lot to in this work. Manny Velasquez, clearly, because we've been at 2 institutions, and then I came to succeed him as director of the Markkula Center. David Vogel at Berkeley, who I've had an ongoing debate and dialogue with throughout the 40 years I've been in this field. Jim O'Toole, who was at USC, has been a senior fellow here at the Ethics Center, the Markkula Center, with whom I continue to have lots of interaction. There are any number of additional people who've made a difference in my life. Buzz McCoy, who ended up endowing the Stanford Center on Ethics. Buzz brought me together with Milton Friedman, and 3 times he set up opportunities to debate Milton Friedman. The last is a video that's available online for Stanford Business School's 75th anniversary, and in which we, along with Buzz and David Brady, a professor at Stanford in my group, debated corporate responsibility. Buzz had a huge impact on me. And I have to say my lifelong friendship with Jerry Kavanaugh, who's twice been dean of University of Detroit Mercy's Business School, also chancellor there. Jerry, over the years, has been a fellow here at the Markkula Center, visited at Stanford. We've exchanged opportunities to share ideas and perspectives, and he has shaped my thinking very vividly. I suppose the bottom line from all of this work is that most of us in this first generation of people in business ethics found our way to the field in idiosyncratic ways. There wasn't a single approach or a single, if you like, established academic approach. Closest thing to that is probably Ray Baumhart hiring Pat Werhane and Tom Donaldson at Loyola Chicago way back when in the 70s. But beyond that, I think each of us have been a bit unique in our coming to this field. So I feel very fortunate to have had the mentors and the colleagues and the opportunities that I have over this period of time. And I'm glad to be a part of any follow-up to this history project and help in any way that I can. Thank you.